Welcome to Board of Building Standards presentation of residential occupancies with Jay Richards. We only have an hour this afternoon and there's a lot of material to cover. So we're going to ask you to put your questions and answers in the Q&A, or your questions in the Q&A. We'll publish them for everybody to see them. And if we can get to them at the end, we will. But if we cannot, everyone will be receiving an email with all the questions answered by staff after the conclusion of these programs. Today instructing is Jay Richards. He is an architect administrator with the Board of Building Standards. He has been an architect in Columbus and Ohio for many years and has been with the board for about 5 years. He is chiefly responsible for our residential code development and is also active in our OBC and plumbing mechanical code development. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you to Jay. I know he's got a lot to cover.
Thanks, Meg. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess I am the first presentation for the afternoon. Meg gave me such a wonderful introduction. I don't know that I need to go through that again. Welcome to Friday. This morning I called it Just for Fun Friday, but with a bonus. You are actually earning CE credits today for the hour that you will spend with me. As with my presentation this morning, I tend to pack a lot of things in there, probably too much. Sometimes it challenges me to get through to the end in the time allotted. So I will probably be moving through things fairly quickly. Hopefully I can cover them thoroughly enough and not lose anybody. So without further ado, how about we get started with the presentation itself. Meg?
Your presentation is live.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about occupancy choices. The reason we're doing this is because a lot of times people call me up on the phone and they say they have a residential building, and after I talk with them for a little while, I find out that, yeah, it's a residential building, but it's an apartment complex. Maybe it is a single family dwelling, or maybe it is a single family dwelling as a dwelling unit, but it is attached to a commercial occupancy building. So those all make differences in terms of which code is applicable to that scenario. So we thought we'd put together a presentation that talked about the various occupancy choices that are out there when it comes to residential occupancies. So what we are going to talk about today is going to be the OBC and the RCO scope, relationship, and their use for residential occupancies. I'm going to start off with a little bit of history about it all. I'm going to move into some examples of things that are outside the scope of the code. Talk about stuff that's inside the code, which code and to what extent. And finally, we're going to be talking about approvals for those things and which jurisdiction has the approval authority and which edition of Chapter 1 applies. So to start with, a lot of times this comes out of the fact that people are just generally ingenious. They want to make the best use of their available resources to meet their needs. They have requirements to move around. They have requirements to make and create things. They have nourishment requirements. They need to find shelter. They want to learn things. And generally, they just want to live. They want to be happy people moving through life and do things. So they're trying to find ways to work out things in their lives, including making investments and making a living and putting a roof over their head. Part of being ingenious happens over time. There's technology developments and advancements, and this is just a timeline to kind of talk about what has happened with the building industry. We started off with simple shelters, and we're getting really close to approaching that mile-high building. Over time, things change. The other thing that we find out and have lived through over time is that life is valuable, that there are natural disasters, there are fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, lightning strikes, floods, things that impact our safety as we are living in the world. And out of wanting to protect and defend from that, we started developing laws and rules and regulations and compliance with those to create, in the built world anyway, safe and sanitary conditions. So part of this, Ohio has established building codes. They are primarily responsible to create safe and sanitary environments without limiting that ingenuity. We don't want to hamper people in their pursuit of finding something better. The first published building codes in Ohio were in 1911. We actually have a copy of it. And dwellings were added as a statewide code in 2006. We are currently working on the 2019 edition of residential codes. Stepping back a bit, that first edition in 1911 was primarily dealing with commercial buildings, schools, and movie theaters. So how does this come to be? The revised code gives authorization to the entity known as the Board of Building Standards to formulate and adopt what we call the rules of the board that you know as the building codes. These rules are meant to govern the erection, construction, repair, alteration, and maintenance of all buildings and classes. And in Ohio, since 2006, these are separated into two families of codes. There's the Residential Code of Ohio, and then there's the Non-Residential Building Code, also known as the Ohio Building Code. So some definitions about building, which is primarily what the building codes are going to address. There's a very broad definition of buildings, that it's any structure that consists of any of those pieces and parts: foundations, walls, columns, girders, beams, floors, roofs, or any combination of these parts with or without the other parts. So that is the broad definition of a building. There's also a definition of a residential building, which this is fairly simple. It has two basic parts. One part, and the first part, is that it says what a residential building is, that it's a 1, 2, or 3 family dwelling house and any accessory structure incidental to that dwelling house. Those are going to be residential buildings. There's a lot of things that may cover, and there are some things that we are statutorily not able to regulate. So within this definition, they also say what a residential building is not. And it does not include industrialized units, manufactured housing, and mobile homes. Those are all defined in greater detail in other divisions of the revised code, and we will get into some of that information as we proceed in this presentation. Another good definition is non-residential building. Pretty simply, it's any building that's not a residential building. So we start off with, this is a residential building, and everything else that we're going to regulate that is not a residential building. So you kind of see where this is going. There are residential occupancies in both codes. The OBC, or that non-residential building, has classification group R. So group R1, group R2, 3, 4, you may be familiar with. Things like hotels, motels, apartments, dormitories, row houses, townhouses, and then care facilities. The RCO, Residential Code of Ohio, regulates those residential buildings. Remember, the residential building is a 1, 2, or 3 family dwelling that's not a manufactured home, industrialized unit, or mobile home. So how do we know which one and under which family that particular building or the building that's being proposed by the owner is regulated under? So, when we think about these buildings, there's all different kinds. This is obviously a building. It looks like an apartment complex, probably has multiple dwelling units in it. But when you think about places where people can live, what do you think? They can live under the water in a submarine. They can live on the water in a ship. Those things have places to live, sleep, eat, all the things that you would normally think. But are they regulated by the rules of the board? You get your typical homes. You get tiny homes. You get tree houses. Going a little bit further, you have campers. You have motorhomes. You have park trailers. You have manufactured housing, mobile homes. So what is regulated? There was a number of things in there that are regulated. There was a number of examples in there that are not regulated. So let's look at what is outside the authority of the rules of the board first. Typically, they're going to be, if the intended purpose or the primary use of that thing, that structure, is not as a building, so like the ships, planes, trains, wagons, trailers, motorhomes, park trailers, they get progressively more and more like a building, but they are still having that primary use as something that moves. It is intended to be transported. You may be taking your home with you in those scenarios. There are also some building types that are specifically excluded under each of these codes. Sometimes it's an agricultural exemption. Specifically excluded under both codes is manufactured housing and mobile housing. Specifically excluded is a type A family daycare. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. So typically what we'll find is that there are other agencies that have regulation over these various types of things that are outside the scope of the rules of the board. So the board has the authority to write rules. Those rules are recorded as Ohio Administrative Code, and as part of that, we include definitions in those to help narrow down and focus and help identify which code regulates the various types of residential occupancies. The first definition we're going to look at is the definition of a dwelling. And this is dwelling without the word unit. It's just a dwelling. And they are exclusively 1, 2, and 3 dwelling units. And it's occupied by a family and no more than 5 lodgers or boarders. And it's intended to be built, used, rented, leased, let, or hired out, and occupied for living purposes. And they're going to be physically separated from adjacent structures, and each dwelling unit is going to have an independent exit. So essentially a dwelling is going to be referring to a particular kind of building, and that building has 1, 2, or 3 dwelling units within it, each one with independent exit. The occupancy of 5 lodgers and boarders is going to become important when we start looking at some of the other residential occupancies, and I'll remind you of that when we get there. The other definition is dwelling unit. So now this is the single unit that provides complete independent living facilities and has permanent provisions for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation. So that's going to help us understand what a dwelling unit is, which is a piece that makes up a dwelling. One of the things that was introduced in the last Ohio Building Code update was the concept of a care facility. With the pressures out there in the world to be that care for people is moving away from institutional occupancies and moving into more familiar home-like surroundings, there's this whole development of a care facility in a place that looks like a home. That starts to create some of its own regulatory issues. And so to help resolve that and clear that up, make it a little easier to navigate, we have this definition of care facility. And it is primarily held out to the public and for an intended purpose. And that intended purpose is to do three things. It's to house or accommodate, there to as a facility to provide personal, custodial, or medical care, and those are all defined terms, and they are specific to the building codes in terms of personal care, custodial care, and medical care, and it's in a supervised environment. For it to be a care facility, all those conditions have to be present. It's held out to and intended to provide housing accommodation, a type of care in a supervised environment. If it's missing one of those, it is not going to be considered a care facility. We also found in our discussions that we needed to help kind of put bookends on this definition. So the last sentence there is to help describe a care facility by describing a situation that is not a care facility. It may have all of those pertinent things that are highlighted above, but if that care is provided in a dwelling or a dwelling unit that is the permanent residence of the care provider, it is not a care facility. So that's to help deal with the parents, with children who are taking care of parents, and I should say adult children who are caring for their aging parents, or a spouse caring for the other that requires care. Just because you're providing care doesn't mean that it's going to turn it into a care facility. Another definition, because of the invention of Airbnbs and VRBOs, and people are ingenious and they want to make money on their vacation properties, we have developed the definition of a transient lodging structure. And this is going to be specific to a single dwelling unit, so a single family dwelling, that's held out to the public for lodging of not more than 20 transient occupants. The reason we have the transient in there, and we give you some examples there, we have transient in there because once they are, the occupants are moved away from primarily permanent, they are transient, stays less than 30 days. That becomes a group R1, hotel, motel under the OBC, and that triggers all kinds of requirements that are excessive for this size of lodging facility. So we've created a structure to give some relief to the people that are renting their vacation home or their home on the beach for short-term stays. So I just love this picture. This was sent to me because some building official was asking about that structure in the front there and wondering about the authority to regulate that addition. And why I include this is because it has multiple examples of buildings or structures or things that people live in that might be considered their residence. Some of them are regulated by the rules of the board, some of them are not. The structure over on the left, it looks like a stick-built house, possibly a modular home. That very possibly could be regulated under the RCO. The structure in the middle looked to us and was confirmed that it is much more like a park trailer, which is outside the rules of the board, and that addition is attached to it. So it's a modification of a structure that's not regulated by the rules of the board. The structure in the back is looks to be a manufactured house, and it is specifically outside the rules of the board. And then, of course, you have the travel trailer, which is built on a chassis with running gear and wheels, and it's meant to be pulled down the road. Again, outside the scope of the rules of the board. But I just kind of imagine that there's people living in all of these things right now, today, at this moment. So again, we go back to this concept that we have two codes. And what's going to be within the authority of the rules of the board. There's two of them, and we have to figure out which one is applicable. We have the statewide residential code, or the residential code of Ohio, and it's going to regulate all residential buildings. Again, that's a defined term. We talked about what that defined term was. 1, 2, and 3 family dwellings, not a manufactured home, not an industrialized unit. Then we have those things that it excludes. Then we have the non-residential code, the Ohio Building Code. It's going to have buildings identified in 3781.06 that have residential occupancies in them. So that's going to be the group R1s, the group R2s, the group R3s, the group R4s. And it specifically excludes dwellings because they're regulated in the residential code of Ohio, manufactured house, and other types of things like federally owned and operated. There could be residential properties or residential units in buildings like that. You have to pay attention to that as well. So we kind of get a picture of two codes. There is a process that gets followed in terms of the regulation of the building codes, and it's good to remember that owners initiate this process and building departments respond to that initiation by the owner. Remember, the owners are the ingenious ones. They want to do something. They want to develop something. Building departments are going to respond to that desire for them to do something or create something. So the owner is going to present the intended use of what they're trying to do, and that intended use will guide which family of codes will regulate that structure. Sometimes their intended use is going to be a change of use or occupancy, which may move the regulation of that structure from one set of building codes to the other set of building codes, and we have to pay attention to that. So we're going to take some time and look at some examples. We're going to look at some traditional stick built, a modular home, manufactured home, a duplex, an apartment building, cabin, transient lodge, tiny home, container home, houseboat, tree house, and I'm going to talk about how each one of these fits into one or the other family of codes and possibly when it would switch. So the first one I want to look at is sort of that traditional stick-built single-family dwelling. It is obviously as a single-family dwelling going to be regulated under the Residential Code of Ohio. And we had that concept of care facility out there, and where that comes into play is, and that there's two concepts working together here. One is the care facility, and the other is the definition of a dwelling having 5 or fewer lodgers or boarders. There is one exception that allows a care facility with 5 or fewer lodgers or boarders to remain a single-family dwelling regulated under the Residential Code of Ohio, and that's if all the recipients of care are capable of self-preservation. Other than that, if a care facility is in a traditional single-family home and there's more than 5 lodgers or boarders, it starts potentially becoming some form of group home, some form of child care. It may shift out of the residential code as the regulatory authority and require a change of occupancy into the Ohio Building Code. The other option that we see under the use of a traditional single-family dwelling that some people use is you may see that they want to use it for a limited period of time for something other than a residential occupancy. Weekend rental for a golf tournament or a corporate retreat for some reason. There is an option for a person that has a single-family dwelling. They can make application to the commercial building department and apply for a time-limited occupancy under the OBC and get the use of that building for a fixed period of time to be a commercial occupancy, and then it will revert back to a residential occupancy under the Residential Code of Ohio. A couple of things to think about as you're looking at single-family dwellings and how they can be regulated by either code, but primarily they're going to be regulated through the Residential Code of Ohio. So a modular home, typically these are going to be industrialized units. They have been constructed off-site, closed construction. They are moved, transported to the site and erected on-site. These are the off-site portion is going to have to get approval by the manufacturer through the industrialized unit program at the Board of Building Standards. The owner, in constructing a modular home, is going to have to go to the residential building department and get approval for that industrialized unit. That residential department is going to have authority over all of the site-built construction. So typically foundations, possibly utility connections, any kind of finishing construction to put those modular units together. So there is responsibility here for a home that is a modular home will be regulated by a residential department for that site-built stuff. Once that industrialized unit is set, that whole thing becomes a single-family dwelling regulated under the Residential Code of Ohio, and any alterations, additions, repairs to that building will go through the residential department at that point. So a manufactured house, a mobile home, these obviously are exempt from the rules of the board. They could be in a park, they could be on private property. The setting and resetting of manufactured homes is actually under the authority of the Division of Industrial Compliance Manufactured Homes Program. I should probably back up one step. The manufactured home is distinctly different from a modular home in that it is built in accordance with housing and urban development standards, federal regulations, and that's why, big reason why it's outside of our control, and it is regulated by the Manufactured Homes Program. What I can say about manufactured homes is that is applicable to the home itself. If that homeowner wants to add an accessory structure that is detached from that manufactured home as a detached structure to a residential building, to a dwelling, it is regulated by the Residential Code of Ohio for just that accessory structure, and it must be detached. If that accessory structure is attached to the manufactured home, it's actually a modification of the manufactured home and has to comply with manufactured home rules. So it's a modification of that structure. To help everybody understand sort of the break and the split in jurisdiction between that, the Board of Building Standards and Division of Industrial Compliance have created a manufactured homes program joint advisory, and it's part of the handout sheet materials that were for this program. And there's more explanation in there about how the authority to enforce and the various jurisdictions on manufactured homes and RCO divides in that. When you get to 4 or more units in a building, you have automatically moved past being a residential building, and you now are in a commercial building. And as a commercial building or a non-residential building, you will be regulated under the Ohio Building Code. And that the Ohio Building Code, as I've indicated, has several different Group R or residential occupancies. Most notably are going to be the R2s and R3s for primarily permanent residents. R2s are going to be apartment buildings, dormitories, things with shared exits. Group R3s are going to be like row houses, townhouses, where it is a series of dwelling units that all have independent exit to the outside. So then we get to the family cabin, that vacation property, that building that is used infrequently by the homeowner. If it is a cabin that is for family use, it is not a transient lodge. It is regulated by the Residential Code of Ohio because it is a dwelling unit exclusively, in this case, single family dwelling, has independent exit. So it would be regulated by the Residential Code of Ohio. As soon as an owner wants to rent or lease this property for stays less than 30 days, that becomes a transient occupancy. Risks go up, therefore it is a change of occupancy, and the only place that we really have to park a transient overnight stay is in Group R1 of the Commercial Building Code, or the OBC. So that regulates it. As part of that, we have developed code language to give some relief in the case where a single family resident like this is used for transient occupancies with less than 20 people. There's and it allows for the owner to build that structure or comply with the residential code for construction criteria, but it is still regulated by a commercial building department and under the OBC. So it's an important distinction. Oh, I'll go back. To help understand what the various rules are with this, we have created a matrix that outlines all the different types of transient lodges and the various requirements that come into play to get that relief. So there's a full transient lodge, which is a full dwelling unit. There's a semi-primitive transient lodge, which is something that has overnight sleeping but doesn't have all of the features of a dwelling unit. And then there's a primitive transient lodge, which is sleeping only and no other features of a dwelling unit, including utilities. It is strictly a sleeping unit, and they all have different requirements. But they're still, as transient lodges, they're still regulated under the Ohio Building Code. So hotels, motels, inns, and lodges, these all look like collections of either sleeping units or possibly dwelling units. In many cases, they could have dwelling units. Because it is transient, they are regulated under the OBC. They will be classified as either Group R1 or Group R2. When you get a sufficient number of them, you want to know that State Fire Marshal may have licensing requirements for those units. And it's typically 5 or more sleeping rooms. State Fire Marshal has licensing requirements. And when you get into Group R1, accessibility, and R2, accessibility requirements start to apply. So this is going to be important for all transient lodges, including the single families. But when you get bigger and larger and more, you may not be able to use the Residential Code of Ohio, and you'll have to comply with all of the requirements of the OBC. And that's typically going to be when you get into a collection of sleeping units versus a single family dwelling, and provisions apply. So tiny homes, there's a lot of questions about tiny homes out there. Because we're going to think about it as a tiny home, so we're going to think about it as a dwelling that's small. And as a dwelling, it's going to have all the permanent provisions for sleeping, eating, cooking, sanitation, and living. It's just small. There is no restriction in the residential code about size in terms of big, small. There are some measurement criteria like ceiling height and width requirements and things like that, but there's not a requirement on overall size. So this is still regulated under the Residential Code of Ohio, which will mean there's going to be foundation requirements. There's and more than likely, the tiny home is not going to comply with all of the requirements in the Residential Code of Ohio. So there's likely going to be a need to get a variance from the appeals process to get approval for the tiny home. Sorry about the phone interruption there. The other thing about a tiny home is a lot of times that they are left on a chassis with its running gear, and it is actually more indicative of or similar to a travel trailer or a park trailer. And in general, if the tiny home is constructed on an integrated trailer and it's left on its running gear, we are generally going to consider that outside the scope of the rules of the board. It's going to be regulated. Its primary purpose is intended to be moved. It's to haul your house with you. But if it's going to be permanently installed, it's going to be put on a foundation, it's going to be a dwelling regulated under the Residential Code of Ohio. Let's convert that container into a single family home or a combination of them and make a multifamily complex. Obviously, if it's a single family dwelling, you're going to regulate it under the Residential Code of Ohio. The container itself, you're going to have approval for the container, and that's likely going to be the biggest challenge that's out there to get approval. There's actually a BBS memo out on the use of containers in construction, and it talks about evaluation service reports, and there's 3 of them out there currently that I'm aware of that talk about the way to get approval to use a shipping container or an intermodal container. It's very possible and likely that the use of that container, as you start thinking about cutting openings in it, as shown in the picture, that you're going to require a certain amount of alternative engineered design or some sort of variance, because most of the evaluation service reports do not address modifying the container. If you're going to put a collection of these together, creating a multi-family situation with obviously 4 or more dwelling units, then you've moved over into the OBC for regulation, and you comply with that. Again, approval of the shipping container, materials, methods of construction, that kind of stuff as a component in the construction is going to be probably one of the biggest challenges. And again, evaluation service reports on that. Also, you may require alternative engineered design for this, because it's that very creative, very ingenious use of materials. How about a houseboat? It's a house, it's floating on the water. We are generally going to consider that it's outside of the scope of the building codes. Just in general. Then we get to the treehouse. So here again, I think a lot of this is going to depend on obviously how it's being used. If it's simply a single family dwelling, it's going to be regulated under the RCO. If it's going to be used as a transient lodge, it's going to be regulated under the OBC as a transient lodge. More than likely, treehouse is going to require some form of variance to be compliant with either one of those codes, because both of those codes have the requirement that all the loads need to be transmitted to the supporting soils. And there's going to have to be some understanding of how that happens. And typically the building codes do not rely on natural products and materials like tree trunks to be a supporting member transferring that load to supporting soils. And again, you're elevated off the ground. If this is transient lodge, regulated under the OBC as a group R1, you may have some accessibility issues that may be needed to be addressed relative to the treehouse. It's an example of a structure that is going to be regulated under the rules of the board. It is not exempt, and it creates its own set of challenges. It creates a number of issues that will require some ingenuity to be compliant. So when it comes to getting approvals for all these types of structures and how they're being used, the Ohio Revised Code says under 3791.04 that an owner shall not begin construction without approval. So you got to get approval, and that's going to be whether it's Residential Code of Ohio or Ohio Building Code. 3781.06 identifies the various buildings that are regulated, and that 3781.10 is the authority given to the board to write building codes that regulate these various structures. We also have under 378110, we also have the authority to certify building departments and official and personnel that work in there to perform the various approval processes. And they are broken down into getting residential building certifications or non-residential building certifications. And depending on the use of that structure or the proposed use of that structure, the application for plan approval will have to go to the appropriate authority having jurisdiction, residential or non-residential. A key thing to remember here is that for non-residential buildings, all of Ohio has some authority to regulate the Ohio Building Code. If your local political subdivision does not have a certified building department approved by the board to regulate non-residential buildings, the state of Ohio's building department is the enforcement authority for the OBC. On the residential side of things, for residential buildings, if the political subdivision chooses not to enforce the Residential Code of Ohio, there is no enforcement in that jurisdiction. So the state of Ohio is not a backstop for enforcement of the residential code. If it is a residential code, building regulated by the residential code, and no residential department exists, then the statute stipulates, the law stipulates that the owner does not have to submit for approval of the plans. Without approval of the plans, there's nothing to inspect. Without satisfactory inspections, there's no certificate of occupancy to be issued. That's the enforcement that is not present. Residential Code of Ohio is still the statewide code for residential buildings, and the owners must comply with the provisions in that, short of that enforcement in those areas without a residential building department. The other thing is, when it's determined which building department has enforcement or which building code is enforceable, there is a Chapter 1 that outlines the process for approvals, inspections, and issuing of certificates of occupancy and all that process. They are slightly different between the Ohio Building Code and the Residential Code of Ohio. So you would need to make sure that you're following the processes in the Chapter 1 for the applicable building code that's being enforced. So that's a lot of information crossing back and forth because residential buildings can exist be regulated under the residential code. Residential occupancies can be regulated under the Ohio Building Code. Buildings and structures can change occupancies and move back and forth between them. They may visually on the outside look like a single family dwelling. You may want to think they are a residential building and that would be regulated by the Residential Code of Ohio, but you have to drill a little bit deeper. You have to have an understanding of the intended use of that building, and it's possible that it will be regulated as a residential occupancy under the Ohio Building Code instead of a residential building or dwelling under the Residential Code of Ohio. So that concludes my presentation for today. If there's any questions, Meg, I would be happy to entertain some.
Jay, there are a few questions, several questions on tiny homes.
Okay.
the slide had stated tiny homes will likely require a variance of some requirements from the RCO. What
Yes.
variances?
Yeah.
Also, a variance for container homes, is that possible? A couple of questions on Airbnb or B&B situations.
Okay. The Airbnb one probably is best left to a response with at the end, like a written response, because it gets a little bit complicated. Unless we're dealing with a single family dwelling, then it's likely becoming a transient occupancy and there may very well need to be a change of occupancy or a time limited change of occupancy. On the tiny homes, typically what you'll run into is, because the overall square footage of the house is small, you're going to see issues with appropriate rise and run or minimum rise and run requirements on stairs. You may have ceiling height issues getting up to a sleeping loft. You may have issues with because you have a sleeping area, you're going to have an emergency escape and rescue opening, and there's minimum sizes for that. You may have to define what those are. Basically, what happens is all of the requirements for a traditional single-family dwelling apply to the tiny home. And if you can get the tiny home to meet those requirements, fine. You may not be able to do it because of space constraints, and those will generate a non-compliance issue in plan review from the building official, and that can become an adjudication order that the owner can then appeal and ask for a variance to those conditions. Building officials cannot issue variances. That has to go through an appeals process. What was?
There's another question about tiny homes and ADA compliance.
Okay, so in a tiny home, if as a single-family dwelling, accessibility is not required in the tiny home. However, if you want to make certain things accessible in the tiny home, you can certainly make the attempts to do that. I think space limitations are going to be probably some of your biggest considerations, but there is nothing that requires you to make any dwelling, any building regulated under the Residential Code of Ohio, there's nothing that requires you to make that accessible.
Okay, and will the Board of Building Appeals grant a variance for a container home?
So if it is a container home, and when I hear the word home, I think single family dwelling, that's going to be regulated under the Residential Code of Ohio, and the Board of Appeals does not hear appeals for residential code issues. If a jurisdiction enforces the residential code, part of having enforcement authority is they have to have a mechanism to appeal any orders or violations that are out there that the owner may want to appeal. There is no specific requirements about the makeup of the appeals and who hears appeals for residential code questions. That could be city council, that could be the mayor, that could be the zoning board. You could have your own, the political subdivision could set up their own process there. All the Board of Building Standards cares about is that they have an appeals process available to address adjudication orders that an owner may want to appeal.
Great. Is there a minimum width of interior doors in a residential house?
There is not a minimum width for any door in a residential building other than the exit. A residential building, in other words, a building regulated under the Residential Code of Ohio, is required to have an exit, one, and it has a minimum dimension. All the rest of the doors do not have a minimum dimension.
I think we've actually covered all of the questions except for the ones about Airbnb and B&B kind of issues, which are a more thorny and complicated answer. I remember researching those when I first started with you, Jay.
Yes, yeah. I can say that a B&B, a bed and breakfast, is actually addressed in the Ohio Building Code. If you have a bed and breakfast, it is already addressed in the Ohio Building Code. It is a non-residential property. It's going to be in a single-family dwelling that houses or has 5 or fewer guest rooms, anyway, they classify it as a group R3. And then one of the things that they do out of the Ohio Building Code is they give relief to the homeowner that while it's a non-residential building regulated in the Ohio Building Code, they can use Residential Code of Ohio construction criteria in its construction for approvals if the owner is a resident at the bed and breakfast.
All right, and one more question again on containers. Say I have land and I want to be off the grid. Why is there a need to regulate the containers turned dwellings, knowing that they're not going to meet RCO? Will an engineered report be sufficient to stay out of the RCO? In other words, what's the problem with containers? Why aren't they effective building material, or are they?
So with all construction in Ohio, all the materials, components, systems that are used have to go through an evaluation process, and they have to get approved in terms of they meet performance criteria in how they are used. That's essentially a listing and labeling process. And one of the issues that we have with the intermodal containers, and that's addressed to some degree in that BBS memo, is that there is not in some cases, there's not a good confidence that the materials used and the processes used to construct those containers met the requirements for the building materials that are required to be used. So the issue is that there's not a confidence, like there is with other building materials that are used, that it met certain performance criteria, that it met referenced standards and has the appropriate strengths and ability to resist the various loads. It's not to say that you can't use one. It's just that you have to do the same thing that everybody else does and demonstrate that that material that you're using is sufficiently strong to do the job. And oftentimes that's done through the listing and labeling process by recognized conformity assessment bodies.
Well, Jay, I think that wraps it up. Really great presentation. I'm sure we all learned a lot. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions that stem from this. Your phone's going to be ringing off the hook for a week. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for attending. Thank you for asking great questions. We look forward to hearing from you. And you would now have a 15-minute break until the next program, Industrialized Units, which begins at 2:15. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.